ready to start. Call the meeting to order. Tuesday, October 11th. Item number 1 on the agenda is the approval of last month's meeting minutes.
Second.
Jonathan, second.
I'll second.
I actually noticed one thing that they mentioned Jonathan Tibbetts was absent, and then later on it shows him voting on an action item.
How dare you?
I wasn't there, but maybe it came late.
No, I discussed that already with Ariana, and it's all right. I was absent for that particular motion,
Got it.
and that was the way it was written. Ariana, I was incensed to learn that I was absent. Thank you for noticing it, Kayla, but it's okay.
All right.
Did we vote on that?
Should have said I was late.
Vote on the minutes, yes.
Yeah. So I'm gonna get a vote on. We're gonna.
All those in
favor? One
You
absent.
can vote even if you weren't here.
Oh, I can vote.
You can,
You
even
can.
though you weren't here.
I will vote to approve.
Item number 2, public comments. Do we have anybody from the public to speak? Any communications from network members? Anybody on that? Item 3 and 4 are on our consent calendar. I don't know if anybody has any questions on those. So one of them is the Incentive Growth Program Amendment and Transnet Senior Mini. Questions or concerns or?
I move we recommend.
Okay, got a second. Second. All those in favor? Number 5. Ariana, an update.
Yep, I have an update since your September 13 meeting. The Transportation Committee recommended board approval of the Board of Finance. Oh.
Mass exodus.
Just something to do with what you're going to tell us. They all disappeared.
They were on the consent agenda. So the Transportation Committee recommended board approval of the Plan of Finance update that you saw at your last meeting, and the board subsequently approved the proposed FY18 budget amendments that were included with that Plan of Finance update, and asked that Sandag staff return with further discussion on the revenue assumptions, and that is scheduled for the board meeting later this month. The board also reviewed the overview of financial markets report, which included its annual interest rate swap evaluation, which you will hear more about at today's meeting. The board also approved the annual funding and land management call for projects for the ENP, which you reviewed and supported at your last meeting. And then in addition, at your last meeting, Kim provided you with an update on the board's review of the independent examination and the status of the board's recruitment for a new executive director. The board anticipates closing the investigation later this month, and a subcommittee has been formed to begin the RFP process for the executive search firm.
Questions?
Out of curiosity, we're going to do a search, but we first have to do a search for a firm to do the search. What's the time horizon that's expected?
Let Kim answer that one.
The RFP went out last week. Proposals are due Monday, this coming Monday. And so I think the subcommittee is expecting to make their recommendation on a search firm on November 3rd. So just a few weeks away.
The search can take whatever it takes.
The search, I think we envision by the time they interview candidates and go through kind of the recruitment process, it'll be in the spring sometime, you know, when a candidate is March, I'd say probably the March, April timeframe, when a candidate is probably identified, and then depending on, you know.
Relocation on that.
Yeah, I mean, if they're local versus non-local, but it is a nationwide search.
In the meantime, we're comfortable we are in good hands.
Very good
Are you
hands.
looking at somebody? We have a very strong team that is supporting the work going forward. Yes.
If I could ask a different but related matter
Yeah.
for Kim. Is there any update on the Gonzales Fletcher bill?
So, no, I mean, yes and no. So what is this? Today's the 11th. The deadline's still October 15th, so that's the day that the governor has to sign, veto, or do nothing. The only thing I can report is that his staff has talked with our representatives up in Sacramento and asked questions about kind of our governance structure to try to understand that. Have asked questions on kind of how the negotiations have went along the way and you know, with the assembly member and stuff. And so they've had at least a couple of discussions that. So it's, I think they're actively, you know, considering it. It's not something I think that's just sort of sitting on the side. So, and that's really all we have to report. We're awaiting word. And so one way or another.
Do you know whether any of the active members of San Diego are actively working with the governor for his signature?
No, it's really, I mean, not actively like up there. It's people have submitted letters on both sides, right? So we've submitted our opposed letters. We know some of the stakeholder groups have submitted support letters, or some of the individual jurisdictions have submitted support letters in same respect. Some of the individual jurisdictions have submitted opposed letters. So it's really the same. The way things sort of fill out through the process, people have stayed in their respective camps and stuff and just gone through the process.
Continues to be a divided camp within
Yes.
San Diego.
Yes.
It's actively working to these two letters with the governor.
Yes.
If the governor does sign the legislation, is it known what the timing of
It goes, actually, it formally goes into effect on January 1, next year, so January 1st of next year. Some of the things we need to, you know, obviously change right away. I think it'll be, one of the things, for example, when it, if it were signed and the law go into effect, one of the things it has, for example, is a new audit committee, which includes, like, would include, you know, 3 board members and 2 members of the public, creating an Office of Independent Auditor and stuff. So some of that, while the law goes into effect, I think we're going to have to work towards that. I don't think there's an expectation that January 1, all these things would exist, you know, out of nothing. So there'll be some sort of time to stand up some of the you know, new functions should we go past. I know the board has talked about, and so that's one of the things as they you know, follow through on many of these items is, regardless of the bill passing or not passing, they are interested in looking at auditing functions and potentially creating. We have an internal performance auditor, and in addition to ITOC, and in addition to all the external audits that we do on a regular basis, right? We do performance audits with Transnet, the 10-year review, our capitals and whatnot. But some board members have expressed, regardless of what happens with if the legislation doesn't pass, standing up in a potential internal audit function. And so I think they're committed to moving forward with some of these things. Yeah.
Moving on, number 6, overview of development financial market, Ray and Andre.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee. So this is our quarterly report that we bring on a quarterly basis. The last time we brought it was in May. So you may be wondering why the delay. Typically we're focused in August, but in August we were dark. So we moved the September meeting got a little bit crowded, so we moved it to this meeting in October. Just a heads up, you'll be seeing it again next month. And typically this report is something that Ray and I present to you. Ray talks about the economy, the sales tax, what's going on in the markets. I'll give you an update on the debt portfolio. But our ex-chair, Mr. Halper, had asked us to maybe talk a little bit more about our swaps this time. So we invited Peter Schellenberger, who is from Public Financial Management, PFM, who's basically the 1,000-pound gorilla in our space with financial advisors to governmental entities. I know that there's been some criticism in the press recently about our swaps, so I think we invited Peter to kind of talk about swaps in general, how they related to us, why we did them, and can also talk about other entities and why they've done it. Several of their obviously clients have also used swaps, so I think it'd be better for Peter to kind of talk about it, give you kind of a broader idea about why we did the swaps. So the topics that we intend to cover today, again, Ray will do the market overview of the local economy. I'll talk about it, get portfolio, then we'll switch to Peter to talk about our swaps, and then I'll just talk about the things that we're working on currently. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ray.
Thank you very much. As you know, we presented a couple of months back something called the 7-point plan, where we were working at trying to improve the transparency that in terms of the data that we provide, and also to improve the visualizations that we're doing. And so what I'd like to do is to get your feedback at some point on these next 2 slides, which is part of our attempt to try to become more explanatory and visual with the data. And so we have 2 slides, or 2 slides I'm going to present on. One is on the market, and then the other one is on the San Diego economy. And again, what we're trying to do is to be able to be much more transparent about what's happening. In the past, I've showed you slides also about where we are year to date with collections and things. So it's the direction that we're moving. But in terms of a market overview, as the economy continues to improve from a national perspective, interest rates are starting to rise. I think that's really the takeaway from this particular update. The Dow Jones Industrial continues to perform very well. It's up 24% year over year. And we've been setting new records on a regular basis. The 10-year U.S. Treasuries have also increased year over year. There's a little bit of a bump there that you see after the election, and then you see the spark line comes down, so there's been a little bit of reduction there. And what's happened is that more inflation has started to happen as the economy has recovered, and so you see that Fed funds rates have started to increase. They're up 75 basis points, and back in September of 2016 they were at 0.5, now they're 1.25. And so the rates continue to increase, and this is really precipitated in large part by the inflation, which is getting near the Fed target of 2%. So the Fed has a policy right now that they don't want to see inflation higher than 2%. It's at 1.93% right now. The tool that they use to keep inflation down is to raise interest rates. And so we may be seeing some pressure in raising interest rates if the inflation news continues to be bad, or exceed 2%, I should say. Turning our view to the San Diego economy, the San Diego economy continues to improve. There's been the last 8 years we've just slowly continued to improve through the recession. But we see some flattening out there too, and housing prices are starting to peak countywide. And when we look at unemployment, what we see is that year over year unemployment is down 0.4%. So we're now at 4.3%, which is very close to the national average. We're still lower than California as a whole, but much more close to the national average. And we used to be even lower than that. Part of the reason I believe is that the region is near full employment, which means it's getting harder for employers to necessarily find the right skill sets to put into the open position. And what's happened is that starts to put pressure on wages, and so wages have started to go up too. We haven't seen any real wage growth in the last 3 years. In the San Diego region, it's pretty much been completely flat. So this is good news, especially for workers on the low end who are trying to make ends meet on minimum wage. And we see that there's been a rise between 2016 and 2017 of 4.2%. And then turning our attention to housing prices. Housing prices, the median price of a house is now $538,000. It's up 8.6% from last year when it was about $495,000. And really, the takeaway here is what percentage of San Diego households can really afford to buy the median price home. And right now that index stands at about 28%. Okay? So this is the one that I would watch to see what happens with housing prices, because it's impacted not just by price, but by the ability to borrow. So as interest rates go up, fewer and fewer people can afford the houses, and that may signal the top of the housing market here in San Diego. And then when we look at taxable retail sales, I think that in general there's been higher degrees of consumer confidence, and so what you see is additional sales occurring in the retail industry, and we see that in the last year our taxable retail sales have gone up 3.3%, and that bodes well for the Transnet sales tax revenue that we collect. And with that, that concludes my report, and I'd like to hand it back to Andre.
Before you, just a question, I think before you, these summary charts are quite useful, but I'm wondering whether it would be useful to add an additional one where you have unemployment also state what the absolute employment is. Because it comes to grips with the factor of people who've dropped out of the workforce, and the unemployment measurement doesn't really comprehend that. Because I'm intrigued that wages are going up 4.2, which is very surprisingly good news. I'm curious if employment has gone up significantly. Why retail sales haven't gone up more than 3.3.
So would it be interesting to see employment potentially by different sectors in the economy? Is that interesting to
Well,
this
it's the
committee?
total, which would be
You
the
want the
first
total,
thing.
okay.
And unemployment going down implies that employment has gone up. That's not necessarily the case in the extreme that people
Because of
drop
the
out of the workforce.
Right, okay.
If we knew the percentage increase in actual paying jobs out there,
Okay.
plus the wages, then it really highlights what's driving retail sales.
We will add that.
I was going to say, by way of feedback, also I think this is fabulous, and the effort to make things more visual, succinct. I mean, I think it's a great way to capture an immense amount of data. You know, somewhat relating to Dick's point, I guess the thing that just jumps out at me when I look at some of these numbers, it's easy to forget that we're in a kind of an unusual period of time vis-a-vis things like interest rates and whatnot, given that it's, you know, sort of the we're sort of still in that post-2008 era. And I'm wondering just if it might be helpful for context for at least a few of these, maybe not all, to sort of show the, you know, kind of peak pre-2008 type number, or just something for context. So, for example, wages, you know, I don't really have a clue as to what, you know, pre-crash average wages were.
Okay.
I mean, are we, you know, meaningfully behind still? Are we close? You know, so
yes.
I think, you know, just to add, perhaps you don't want to get these things too crowded, but just perhaps consider that one additional data point just for context. I think would add to the whole picture. But otherwise, I think it's fabulous.
Okay. May I ask one follow-up question?
Yeah, sure.
Would you prefer to see, if you'd prefer to see some more information, if I broke it out into more slides rather than putting more data on? Does that bother? Is it too many slides then at that point?
Yeah, I think it's, at least for me, but others may have a different point of view. I think the concept of if there is, like I'm saying in the case I just raised, you could easily add one bar, like, you know, sort of a historical
Okay.
context. Because when you start getting into too many slides, it sort of dilutes the effort to, you know, provide succinct visual context.
I like the way that this, though, with the 4, I think it looks nice. It's not too crowded. I think if you added maybe more than one bar, it would get a little crowded, but I would think if Dick wants another data point, you could add another one like GDP, which is not on there. So if you wanted another half page or something like that, I don't think it would be that much.
Okay.
Too overwhelming.
Just ask a question just to clarify. Will this financial market report always come with a PowerPoint slide, or only with, okay.
What was the answer to that?
Yes, we always have it ready. Depends on the committee if they want us to go through it, but we will always have slides.
So it's not just for the swaps?
Correct.
Thank you.
I have a suggestion.
Thank you for that feedback.
Just in terms of adding the pre-2008, maybe rather than adding additional bars, you can just have a line on the existing bars indicating where 2008 was.
Okay. We'll find a way to add some of that detail. Thank you for the feedback. Appreciate it.
Okay, so looking at our debt portfolio, the dollar amount outstanding hasn't changed since the last report in May. We have almost $1.8 billion outstanding, including our commercial paper, and interest rates of 3.78%, which is very low based on our portfolio size. One of the big things that did change, though, is we finally closed on a TIPIA loan for $537.5 million, and the rate that we closed at was 1 basis point over the Treasury at that time, so it closed at 2.72%. So you can see that's 100 basis points lower than our current portfolio. To take us 2.5 years, it was an arduous process, but part of saving 100 basis points, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars of savings and interest over the next 30 odd years. And also the flexibility that we have with particularly close it, sitting out there, and we can borrow it at the time that we're ready to borrow it. So, really good program, really flexible, so we're very excited to get that low rate.
Is there a reason why the interest rates aren't listed for each of the series?
They are interested actually in the detail of the report.
Okay.
It's just trying to summarize some of it. It's a little too big, but if you want in the future, I can add those in there.
I think it would be, if one more column was in there with that, it might be helpful, but I don't know if you guys think just a weighted average is enough. But.
Sure, I can add that.
I think I grasped everything, particularly in the previous conversation we had on this. This still staggers me that you're able to go out and get a long-term commitment at a fixed rate. We might or might not draw upon it, and pay no commitment fee.
That is correct. That's one of the attractivenesses of the...
Well, where do we get in this line?
Well, again, I think, TIFIA doesn't have that many outstanding loans. They close maybe a dozen per year. And so I think we feel very fortunate to get it. Now, what we're going to be doing over the next 5 years, probably issuing 3 bands, which is one anticipation notes, which are typically shorter duration, 2 to 3 years, which will be probably half what we're borrowing at 2.7, maybe in the 1.3, 1.5 range. So we'll borrow bands up to $537 million and then take out the bands with the TIFIA loan once we're ready. So it is a very good loan program.
So when you draw it, can you specify, when you decide to finally draw, can you specify what the maturity for that draw will be, or will it be for the duration of the program?
It will be for the duration.
You don't have flexibility on the back end, just the front.
We do have flexibility on the back end too. In fact, for the TIFIA loan, the way we have it structured right now is, right now you'll see on the next chart we have level debt service. For the TIFIA program, it is ascending slightly.
Oh, the deal.
And that's actually in the report. It shows how the TIFIA loan is ascending.
So that's by our design. We could call for a shorter duration if we wanted.
Then looking at our debt service coverage, it's currently at 2.71 times. Last quarter was at 2.65 times. The reason for the increase is that our sales tax actually came in fiscal year 2017 at 3.25% higher than the prior year. So obviously, if our level of debt services level that our sales tax base is increasing, that coverage number increases, so it did increase slightly. Our bond coverage says that we have to be at least at 2 times, so 2.7%, we're way above that coverage. Also, the one benefit of, I should say, the TIFIA loan that we have is actually sitting on the 3rd lien. Our commercial paper is on the 2nd, and we're on the 1st lien. So the TIFIA loan, when we go down, won't necessarily have any impact on our AAA ratings that we currently have with both S&P and Fletch. It's sitting on the 3rd lien, so that's another advantage of the TIFIA loan.
Your debt service ratio here is based on the total Transnet revenues. And out of curiosity, the bond indenture, how did that get discussed when by the ordinance you only allowed X percent to go to major projects, borrowing for major projects, but you collateralize that borrowing with 100% of Transnet revenues, which would be in violation if everything went to hell in a handbasket, of not being able to allocate that much money to major projects.
Well, you're right. I think this is for the entire program. And so if everything did go in a hell in a handbasket, but let's just say during the Great Recession, the numbers went down 17%, right, from top to bottom, and we recovered, and we're above those numbers now. But if we had another Great Recession and the numbers went below that, our bondholders would come to us before the program. So our bondholders would get paid before any of the other streets and streets.
The bondholders got paid. And again, this is a worst-case scenario, and I'm intrigued at how the bondholders can address the issue. That you would be, in theory, in violation of the ordinance allocation percentages for what line items the ordinance got, what percentage of the total tax revenue.
You're correct, but I think our stress tests show that we really would need a triple rate.
Bondholders got comfortable.
Yes.
Yep.
Is there any sort of debt service coverage ratios that are standard when you include the third lien or any of the other liens that we should be aware of, or how does that, what is the ratio for that, and is that something that, even though it's subordinated to the bond holders, is that something you guys look at?
So when we look at the second lien and junior lien where the commercial paper sits at, it has to be at least 1.5 times. And when we get to our TIFIA loan, it has to be, on the third lien, it has to be at least 1.25 times. And again, we've done stress tests on these, and we put out the program, and we don't get close to those levels based on current sales tax.
Question? I like this chart because it's projecting ahead the debt service coverage. It's going to, I believe, but right now, why is it showing your estimated aggregate debt service to be constant through 2048? You will be taking out more debt in the years ahead, and revenue will be increasing, obviously. So this is just based upon 1 year's position, am I correct?
You're correct. And if you look at the actual report itself, we do have a dotted line as to what that coverage will look like in 5 years once we draw down on the TIFIA loans. That's in your report. I guess also, I could put that in the next time.
I don't need to add anything. I'd subtract all those future, after 2007, 2018, I'd almost eliminate that bottom vertical blue line once you think, or unless I'm misunderstanding this. I don't know why it's showing the same.
No, we have level debt service right now on all the outstanding commitments we have through 2048. We'll be adding the TIFIA loan approximately 5 years from now, and that'll be an ascending loan structure, and that's actually shown in your report what that will look like. So this is current profile today. Okay. And what you have in your report will be what it will potentially look like in 5 years from now.
I realize, I guess this is per 100 million.
Yes.
And maybe to clarify as well, so Sandbank has $1.7 billion of debt outstanding issued, and this is the principal and interest repayment on that 1.7 billion.
Oh,
This is the repayment schedule that's already set in stone that's associated with 1.7
for existing debt.
For existing and drawing.
But aren't we going to be going out for more long-term debt in the years ahead?
That's it's proposed.
It's proposed. So that's not entered into this graph, this chart.
Correct, that's the one in the report on page 5.
Am I missing something?
Page 5 of your
Well,
report.
Page 5
the
of
future,
amendment
in
6.
theory, the future debt issuance may not happen. It's likely to, but it may not, right?
Okay, did I miss something?
So that's the
PowerPoint.
Oh. All right, thank you.
And I can overlay that next time.
Yes, there it is, that's what I was looking for.
Yeah, I mean, some of the things, we show this very conservatively, so we show these coverages based upon the fiscal year that just ended, FY 2017. But in theory, revenues will actually increase over time, so these coverage levels are going to be different, but for conservative nature, nothing changed. We only collected what we collected last year. This is the kind of coverage we would be having, which exceeds the 2.7 at this point in time exceeds the 2.0 that's required in your indenture.
Well, thank you. Well, this answers my question.
So now I'll turn it over to swaps.
Great. Okay. I know several of you are familiar with interest rate swaps. They can be, for those who have not sat through the interest rate swap discussion, there'll be questions, so feel free to stop me along the way. I'll start with the sort of motivating question, why use an interest rate swap at all? You have two basic types of debt. You have fixed rate debt, which we typically use for our home mortgage. You go out, you lock in a rate, which is locked in rate for TIFIA of 2.7%. You know what that rate is. You have a fixed rate obligation. Alternatively, you could have an obligation that has a couple different parts to it. It has a variable rate component that all this does, and it also has an interest rate swap component. So I'm going to talk about something that's got a couple more moving parts, and so with those moving parts comes a little bit more complexity, so it begs the question, why use it at all? So that's the first question. The purpose for an interest rate swap, at least as it pertains to Sandag, is to lock in an interest rate for future issuance. So in 2005, Sandag was building its plan of finance. It was looking forward to projects it wanted to deliver over the next 5, 6, 7, 10 years. And within that plan of finance, sitting there in 2005, staff identified the need to finance, to issue debt in the amount of about $600 million in 2008. So the question became, is there a way to lock in what at the time was attractive interest rates in 2005 for an issuance that would occur in 2008? And really, the only way one can do that, the only way an agency can do that, is through an interest rate swap. So on a fixed rate bond, you can issue bonds, up to 10, 12 months is pushing it, maybe 10 months ahead of settlement, ahead of debt closing. So you can do it forward about 10 months ahead. Here we were attempting to lock in interest rates 3 years ahead of the issuance for an identified need. So that's the reason why an interest rate swap was used in this case.
So if I could just ask, so in effect you're saying there isn't a market for 3-year fixed municipal debt. Is that basically the rationale?
Correct. Theoretically, it would be crazy, it would be wildly expensive, because you're asking some investor to take risk for the next 3 years on where interest rates will be in 3 years. So they would really price that in. But as it turns out, there's simply not a market. So that was the purpose of the interest rate swap, to provide budget certainty for $600 million of bond issuance that was coming 3 years down the road in 2008. So who else? Is this unique to Sandag? The answer is no. Many various issuers use interest rate swaps, and here we list a representative list, not an exhaustive list of issuers in California. A lot of folks had the same sort of predicament. Typically, capital-intensive agencies that have forward-looking plans where there's identified needs, and there's usually 2 or 3 variables of uncertainty with these capital plans. What are my costs going to be? What are my revenues going to be? What's my cost? What's my interest rate going to be? So a lot of these capital agencies try to reduce some of that uncertainty and taking on and trying to narrow down and nail down with the interest rate. You can't lock in the cost on the project, the construction cost. You can't lock in where revenues will be, but you can at least take that third element off. So here, there's quite a few agencies throughout California that have used interest rate swaps.
Excuse me, it's like several agencies obviously have used interest rate swaps.
Yeah.
Have many of those used interest rate swaps prospectively when they didn't really have any debt and they were just trying to lock in rates and they paid a cost for that? You have no borrowing cost for those 3 years. You just have hedging costs.
Have folks used forward, we'll say forward starting interest rate swaps? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. Again, because it's the only tool that can lock in an interest rate, today's interest rate, for an issuance that's coming down the road 2 or 3 years. So any agency that had a desire to do that pretty much had to use an interest rate swap at that time. Yeah.
But you're paying a price to lock in that interest rate. You're paying a cost for those 3 years.
You are making no payments until the interest rate swap begins. So for instance, in Sandag's case, we entered into interest rate swaps in 2005. They became effective in 2008. There were no payments made from anybody, a counterparty or Sandag, between 2005 and 2008. So within that contract, so I'll just pause there. Is that clear? There's no payments made between the time in which you enter into the contract and at the start date of that contract. So no payments were exchanged between 2005 and 2008. Okay, so here's a little bit of the anatomy of an interest rate swap, if you will. An interest rate swap is a contract, and it establishes the exchange of an interest rate between 2 counterparties. So here we have Sandag on the left and bank counterparties on the right. Sandag has 2 bank counterparties, Goldman Sachs and Bank of America. And the swap contract simply says this: Sandag, we will pay a rate of 3.68% through 2038 to these 2 financial institutions in return for a floating variable rate. In return for
3 years now.
I'm sorry?
Starting 3 years hence.
Correct. Starting in 2008 in this case. That's right. So that's what the interest rate swap contract achieves. It's just an exchange of interest rates. I'll pay you a fixed rate, and in return you'll pay me a variable rate. I'll put a second piece to that, but I don't talk about it.
So you have, in that contract, you have specified the variable rate that you will receive, the formula driven, and you do not yet know what variable rate you expect to pay when you borrow money 3 years ago.
That's correct. The variable rate will change, and we don't know where it will be 3 years, 4 years.
I know the rate will change, but the formula of what index and what premium you're paying, that's all unknown in your negotiations, but you're locking into that exposure when you do your deal on day one.
You are defining fixed rate, 3.68%, defined in 2005, and the formula for receiving the variable rate is defined also. You know what the formula will be.
You don't know how that formula is going to match up to what formula you get in your borrowing, but you do them 3 years ago.
To some degree, that's right. Yeah, you're bidding on something that you can call basis risk, and then I'll walk through that. So up top, you have a swap contract, and it's an exchange of two interest rates. I'll pay you a fixed rate. In return, I'll receive a variable rate. The purpose of that whole swap contract is simply to lock in that 3.68%, the sole purpose. However, you have not raised any funds for projects yet through the swap. You just locked in a rate. So to raise funds for projects, you have to issue bonds. And in this case, you issue variable rate bonds. Variable rate bond is matched with the swap contract. Okay? And so we're characterizing the receipt of variable rate payments with the squiggly line, the red squiggly line. The bank counterparty is paying a variable rate to Sandag. And Sandag, when it issues the variable rate bonds, will pay a variable rate to bondholders. Okay? And then to the extent that your variable rate receipts, your inflows, equal your variable rate outflows, they cancel each other. And that's the idea and the concept behind the interest rate swap. Your inflows equal your outflows, and you're left paying the 3.68%. That's the conceptual structure that does the work. Okay?
How do you determine variable rate 2? Is it the same index that you're getting in variable rate 1?
Yeah.
So then that they would swap, would be equal to each other? Or?
Good question. I will show you actual numbers. We'll be clearer once we put in some actual numbers. But conceptually, you're receiving in either 68% of LIBOR, which is a taxable index, 68% of LIBOR, or you're receiving SIFMA. So you're receiving something driven by an index. Meanwhile, on your bonds, you have remarketing agents that are going out and selling those bonds on a weekly basis, remarketing those bonds, on a weekly basis to investors. So that's not driven by an index. That's driven directly by an investor demand. It so happens that the investor demand informs the index, and the two are very closely related. But that's fundamentally the question. I want to end up as close as I can to 3.68%. I'm receiving a variable rate, and I'm paying a variable rate, and if there's a disconnect between those two, there can be some additional costs.
The non-variable rate is never tied to an index. It's always remarketed on the marketplace.
Let's see. There are various products. One could use. If you issue variable rate bonds, then correct. The simple answer is correct. You're simply remarketing those bonds to investors and they're purchasing. You could enter into a direct loan with the bank, and you could specify within the loan contract with the Bank of America or what part and say, I want to pay you over the next X number of years something tied to a variable rate tied to an index, and then you could equate those two, your receipts, exactly to your outflows. So you could reduce basis to zero through a direct loan.
So just to make sure there's clarity in terms of what the potential risk is between the two variable rates, is it the case or not that in the second variable rate, you're manipulating the duration or the term in order to match the variable rate 1, right? Because there's going to be a difference between, 1 day loan, 1 week loan, 1 month, 3 months. So are you actually manipulating that term to make sure that the rate equates to the first one? Or is there true risk between the two variable rates? If you understand my question?
I do, yeah. You do want to think through the variety of questions that you're posing here. Should I issue publicly sold variable rate bonds? If I issue publicly sold variable rate bonds, should they be in a weekly mode? Should they be in a daily mode? Should I issue an alternative product, like a direct loan? Should I enter into a direct loan in which I could specify the exact index that I receive on my swap contract? So those considerations are thought through. And once you think through them, you then go about either entering into a variable rate loan or issuing the bonds. In this case, you issue variable rate bonds in a weekly mode. And it takes some time to change that, so you can't manipulate that on a weekly or monthly basis. But you do go through that thought process as you set up the structure, and then you decide on the security that will be associated with the swap.
So maybe the simplest way to answer the question is there actually is some true rate risk between the two variables.
There is, yeah, there is. And these are obviously very good questions. 3.68% is the fixed rate you lock in on the swap. You want to take a look at the fully loaded cost of this instance. That addresses all your fees, your ancillary fees, and it matches exactly what you receive and what you pay, and is there a difference, is there a disconnect? So I'm going to walk through that. For the snapshot as of 9/11/2017, here are the actuals on the swap structure, and it translates to a total cost of 4.08. That's the cost on this interest rate swap. 4.08. Up top, here there's 4 elements that Sandag is responsible for paying. The fixed swap rate to the swap counterparty, okay, 3.68%. The bond variable rate for the week was 0.8%. I'm going to jump down below. That 0.8% is what you paid. You received from the swap counterparty 0.82%. So you actually did a little better, 2 basis points, 0.02% is a net benefit to Sandag. The goal is to make those equal, and over time they've been very close to equal. You pay remarketing agents to remarket the variable rate bonds every week, and the amount of 0.06%, 6 basis points as an annualized fee. And then for variable rate bonds, there's the option for investors on every weekly reset to say, I no longer want to hold these bonds, I want to put them back. I want to hand them back to the issuer. The issuer in this case is Sandag, and Sandag's not going to hold on to $400 million of cash if there were an event in which you couldn't remarket the bonds. And so you then go to a commercial bank and you purchase liquidity from a commercial bank in the form of a standby bond purchase agreement. In the case of failed remarketing, you would tap into liquidity to standby bond purchase agreement that's offered by, in this case, Bank of America, State Street, and JP Morgan. You draw on that facility. Have you ever had to do that? No. But so the life of the bonds, you've never had a failed remarketing. You don't expect there to be a failed remarketing, even through the Great Recession and the market dislocation. But if there were, in the case there were, you can preserve liquidity. And that cost to preserve that liquidity is 0.36%.
Did any of that fall apart with failed banks in the last cycle?
You had banks that certainly went under distress. Yes. But
Wachovia or something. I mean, if they carried these, if they were your liquidity, you think that those banks are never going to fail, but that's part of the risk, if you will, even though none of us really think those banks are going to fail. But I would imagine that some of the swaps fall apart because of that. But I don't know.
And so if there's two sort of credit qualities to this. Investors go out and look at the AAA rating on Sandag bonds, and they therefore very much desire and hold them. So you're much more highly rated than all the liquidity providers. So back to my point, you've never had to rely on those liquidity providers. The investors are really purchasing these bonds based on Sandag's own credit strength. If you did have to rely on these liquidity providers, certainly there's some commercial bank risk.
How long is the commitment from the commercial banks?
Typically 3 years.
What's the risk of renewing those, and it's an unknown cost? there was a period of time when these variable rates, everything froze, and everything went to default rates, and people were frantic because their money was locked up forever. So it has happened. We've had crises before, wasn't that long ago. So you got an X period of time, and your liquidity expires, and you have to replace that at whatever rate is available at that point in time.
You do take liquidity provider market risk.
There's two risks, whether the guy goes away, but if the thing freezes, and then what the rate is that you'll replace it. You could be wind up paying 3 times its rate, or you could pay half the rate.
Absolutely, yes.
And if I'm doing my numbers right, you're paying 142 basis points all in for your variable.
You are paying
80, 88, and the 36.
36 times 4. I'm sorry, what do you?
You're paying the 80, the 6, and the 36. That's what it's costing you to have your.
In terms of your ancillary fees, 86 plus 36. Yeah. You have the swap rate plus your.
So the real cost is 136 basis points, and you're receiving from your counterparty the 82.
Correct. Yep. So your net cost is 4.08%.
You add that quote loss on the variable transaction to your fixed rate, and you get the all-in fixed rate.
Quote loss on the variable.
You're gaining 2 basis points. You're getting the 0.824 and you're paying the 0.8. So you get 2 bits.
Maybe I'm not following your question. Please, please state that. But that is the
Confirming
total
my
net
understanding,
cost.
you're paying 3.68 plus the shortfall on your variable position.
If there is any.
If there is one.
If there is.
There is one. We're using these numbers.
In this case, there are fees. You have the swap rate, you have the receipts the variable receipt on the swap, and the variable payment on bonds. And that's where the hedge, that's where the sort of offset needs to occur, for this to sort of function. Your variable receipt from the counterparty is intended to offset variable payments on the bonds.
Variable payments plus all the fees that are necessary to have those variable
And
payments.
then you have fees, correct?
It's all part of the same number.
Well, the one thing that definitely goes up, and you want to go up in lockstep, is the receipts from the counterparty and the payments on the bonds. Because you might say, well, what happens if the variable rate bonds go up to 5%? Well, then your receipts on the counterparty should also go up to 5%. So that should offset. You're absolutely right. And that's why we lay it out. You have fees to remarketing agents, those are fairly known and not particularly volatile. And then you have liquidity costs. And so you're subject to the market for those costs every 3 months.
So maybe I'm jumping ahead, but presumably at the decision point as to whether to do this or not, you, in conjunction with Andre, for presentation to the board, went through like a break-even analysis to say, here's the rate, given the costs, right, here's the rate below which interest rates could rise where it doesn't pay us to do this. It only starts paying us to do this if interest rates over the next 3 years go up to some level, right? Is that part of the thought process and analysis? Unless maybe there's more to discuss about the structure, but I'm sort of...
It goes back to the rationale, and that's a good question. It was a look back. It was an assessment of where you stood at a certain point in time, so 2005. We looked at the revenue bond index, and the revenue bond index at the time was about 5.2% on the trade date, 5.2%. On the 20-year average, when you take a look and say, are interest rates favorable today or not, we compared that to the 20-year average of 6.3%. And so at that point we said, without knowing what the future will hold, do you like the interest rate environment today? And so that was really the motivating sort of context in which the decision was made to lock in the swap rate. And a break-even analysis, you know, you sort of know where this sort of interest rate has to be. Once you build out that sort of cost matrix.
Well, that's what I'm asking is if that's sort of an explicit part of the discussion, because, yeah, okay. Because obviously the look back, you know, we could sit here today and say whether, you know, you gained or you didn't, but it's a question of, obviously, if you're at decision-making time, you know, if you guys think interest rates are going to stay flat or down, then, you know, just sit tight, right? Or
yeah, your point is sort of, you're taking a little bit of a position on where you think interest rates are going to go.
yeah,
Right?
exactly.
I think you're right. Stated a little differently, a little more conservatively, I would say, really, you're trying to remove uncertainty almost, except I don't know where it is. But from a historical perspective, I like where they are today. So I think I could lock it in today. So I would argue that's a little bit more of the approach, rather than a speculative, do you think we're going to beat the future? It's really, can we create some certainty in an environment that we're finding pretty good today? And I would argue a couple points, big picture. A lot of moving parts. There's a risk matrix we're going to go through. You guys are kind of checking through the risks. You're kind of thinking through the risks. But $600 million of projects were delivered at a rate, sort of an all-in rate of about 4.1% to date, which is pretty good. It's pretty good. And the floating rate receipts have been matching the floating rate payments quite well since 2008, so the last 10 years. So the interest rate swap, a couple of takeaways. It's been functioning. When you say, is an interest rate swap working as intended, it's really, are your variable rate receipts hedging the payments? So the answer to that is yes, they have been. What's the all-in cost? The all-in cost is around 4.1%. And that's about as far as you could take the sort of historical sort of division, this historical discussion. But a couple more slides.
Excuse me, isn't the operative thing there you're saying at the point in time you went to market with this concept, fixed rate would have been 5.2,
Fixed rate would have been closer to 5.2.
and you effectively locked in 4.2 with some risk.
Yeah, to some degree. I don't want to overstate the benefit. So this is an index, and the revenue bond index is frankly a little lower credit quality than Sandac would have been.
And you could have done better than that.
Yeah, exactly.
Andre would have gone down better.
Andre would have killed it. Exactly. And so that's kind of the anatomy. The goal was to shoot for 3.68%. To your point, you got to show the full picture. The total cost of borrowing is 4.1. That's sort of where you find yourself today. You've delivered 600 million projects for 4.1%. There is the often cited mark-to-market value, the accounting treatment of the swap. The accounting treatment of the swap. A swap is can be viewed as an investment, and on your balance sheet, it is an investment. From a tax perspective, a legal perspective, it's not an investment. It's a debt hedging, a debt management. But it has a value that goes up and down with interest rates. And it generally works like this. Back in 2005, Sandac locked in a rate of 3.68%. If today, that rate dropped to 2.68%, you could go out and cancel that swap. You could go to your counterparty and say, I want to cancel. You have that right. You can do that at any day. Counterparty is going to look at it just simply like this. I'm currently receiving a rate from you at 3.68%. Today, in the market, I can get a replacement rate of 2.68%. You will have to make me whole for that differential. And that's basically what gets you to the mark-to-market.
That's
The
the
remaining
input that's used as the current fixed rate in the marketplace for that duration.
correct. What could he go out? And so that's why I'm saying when interest rates drop, your mark-to-market goes up. There's a replacement rate for it. If interest rates rise, your mark-to-market will get closer to zero.
Interest rates drop, and we will show a liability on our books.
In the meantime, you can show that. That liability is currently about 79 million. If you wanted to go out and cancel the swap, that would be the payment you would have to pay. The corollary to that is, well, if interest rates are so low, I perhaps can beat the all-in rate of 4.1%. And you could. You could go out and refund it. But we run the analysis, so it's not as if you would pay a net sum of 79 million. you would have to compare what you would pay for the life of the swap under the current market at a lower rate and then compare debt service and into something lower than that. But there is still a net cost to terminating the swap. And this payment would be $79 million. That's what makes the headlines. It's $79 million on my end. But you really have to do it at both total debt service cost to new replacement debt service cost.
You just sit and assume you're gonna live with your position until maturity, and you're trying to zero in.
It goes back to why you put the swap on. It was not speculative. It feels as if you're taking a position on where you thought interest rates were going, but really you were trying to create some budget certainty, and you accomplished that, and you delivered projects at a rate of 4.1%. And that's it. And then it's an instrument that continues going forward, and if you wanted to restructure it, there's a cost to restructuring. Currently, it's working very well, and it's providing a cost of 4.1%, which is quite a rate.
How long are the swaps? How long do they go through?
2013. Final word on this. Sandag generally controls through the documents when and if we terminate a swap. So this is not a budget. Calculation is not a budget impact. This is just an accounting balance sheet impact.
Real quick, just again, if we look, you've had this in place since 2005, so that's 12 years. You've got 21 years left, I think. You could say that we've been in an interest rate environment where the rates have been both extremely low and by historical standards they're still fairly low, but they're lower than where they were in 2005. Is that correct, more or less? So it has not been tested in a higher interest rate environment yet. And do we know how swaps have done in that sort of environment?
We do, yeah, there's a long history of swaps. If they're appropriately structured, this is appropriately structured, as interest rates go up, your receipts will offset your payment. You're left with that 3.68% plus the 2 fees. So we don't expect the 4.1% to change much.
You still think they'll match?
Yes.
What you get and what you get.
We do know if interest rates go up, all of a sudden the counterparty will have a payment owing you. So if you cancel, you would receive X million dollars. But you would then have to refinance in a higher interest rate environment. And so the swap is really structured to lock in a rate at a given point in time. And it feels like that, and it is. It locks in that for all in 4.1. Even if you're going to receive a payment, it's not clear that you would want to receive that payment because you would have to restructure a higher interest rate. Here, another historical element is in 2012. So a lot has happened since 2005. I was not the one making this presentation several times since. Nobody saw anything going wrong with the economy or the financial markets, and in 2008, of course, serious dislocation in the market occurred. To your point, it highlighted risks that were always examined and were brought and discussed thoroughly with the board at the time. But it highlighted that there were some moving parts here, and simplicity is better than complexity, in short. It works. It supports AAA ratings. It's not just sort of your staff and your financial advisors saying this. It's outside rating analysts that are looking at the entire portfolio and say this is a AAA rated portfolio. And so that provides comfort to investors, and it should to others. That said, the market changed quite a bit in 2008. Were you going to say something?
No, I'm just saying when you refer to the rating agencies rating something AAA, I think we all have to sort of smile a little bit.
Yeah,
based
right.
on
It started the financial crisis to begin, I guess. But in 2012, the interest rates were so low that there was still, interest rates were low, and so in a low interest rate environment, the replacement rate was well below 3.68%. And so a payment was due to the counterparties. But you can go out and issue debt at that point in time at a new all-in cost of, instead of the 4.1, something closer to about 1.6%. So in 2012, we terminated $151 million of the swap. just to convert it to fixed rate in a very large degree. And again, the analysis is presented on down below. What's the payment structure for the portion of the bonds that we're talking about? And these were just bonds maturing from 2013 through 2021. Payment structure on the bonds under the interest rate swap structure equaled $188 million. We could go out and issue bonds in the amount of $149 million, and coupons were higher than yields, so it generated some premium, so the total sources was $174 million. Those were the total sources of funds. We refunded $151 million of bonds, and we paid a swap termination cost on the portion of swaps that we terminated in the amount of $22.6 million. Well, isn't that a cost? Why on earth would we do that? Isn't that a cost? Why would we cut a check for $22 million to a counterparty? Because I could go out and issue all of these bonds, pay the bonds, pay the swap termination costs at such a low rate that that middle column, when I factor in the payment made to the swap counterparty, is equal to what I would have otherwise paid on the swap structure. So I could afford to pay a swap termination cost and fund the bond, and actually be $11,000 better. And so that was the decision made in 2012, was to shift some of the portfolio away from interest rate swaps to fixed rate. Another.
Obviously includes all your replacement fees in it.
I'm sorry?
Those numbers, I can't read them. They include all your replacement fees.
Correct. Every cost. We got issuance cost of $540 million.
So do you guys do that every year where you look at your mark-to-market value and say, is it a good time to pay off some of these swaps or not?
Yes. Continually monitor the swap. I think where you want to be is you want to have a portfolio that's functioning the way it's intended, that provides a low total cost. And your total weighted average cost is 3.8, and that's before the tipping. And then once you factor in the tipping, you're down to 3.5. So you have a very cost-effective total portfolio. And there's no need to do anything haphazardly or quickly. When the opportunity arises, if you could sort of de-risk, if you will, if you could shift from interest rate swaps to fixed rate, go ahead and do it, but don't pay $1 for it, because there's no need. And that's sort of the philosophy going forward. And since you hit on this, sure enough, back in 2005, this was something discussed in detail, which is the risk maintenance, which everybody's very familiar about these moving elements. There's a variety of risks here. There's counterparty exposure risk. What if your counterparty, Bank of America or Goldman Sachs, goes under? You have a swap policy in place that says you will only enter into swap contracts with counterparties of a certain credit rating. So you control that upon issuance, upon entering into a contract. And then, if they have an obligation to you, if interest rates are such that they may owe you $10 million in the case of a termination, then the way the documents were structured is entirely the same as benefit. They have to post collateral. They have to post collateral. If there is a potential payment due to sandbag, the counterparties have to post collateral.
That's not symmetrical. We don't post collateral. They have to. How frequently do they have to mark?
Correct.
How frequently do they mark the cash collateral?
Well, we mark the market daily.
Okay, they adjust their collateral daily if they're in a position to owe you.
Correct. So that's how you control it going forward.
That statement carries a lot more weight than your first statement that we only enter into deals with high-quality banks like Lehman Brothers.
Well, like Lehman Brothers.
And Bear Stearns.
That's right. So there is the point of contract, and then there's the ongoing collateral posting requirement. Termination risk. There is risk if it were suddenly terminated. This contract was suddenly terminated. The contracts are structured in such a way that Sandac holds all the ability to terminate rests with Sandac. There's a trigger that would allow a counterparty to terminate, and that's if Sandac's senior lien bond rating dropped below triple B minus. Your triple A. So that's very low. So termination risk is very low. Basis risk is what's the likelihood that the receipts on this variable rate is going to continue to match And that's something you have to continue to monitor, but it was not, we thought through that up front, and as it turns out, the two are highly correlated, and they perform quite well. Basis risk is something you continue to monitor. Tax risk is what if there's a shift in the tax structure that could impact this.
Would that not show up on both sides with the
Yes.
index and the rating department and moving still be highly correlated?
Yeah, there's two things that could be. What if Congress were to remove the tax exemption from tax exempt bonds? That feels pretty remote. It's an ongoing discussion every several years, but it never gets legs. And then the second is, what if there's a significant reduction in the corporate tax rate, or a tax rate that would create the tax exempt make the tax exemption less advantageous. And,
Even with that happen, doesn't that affect both what you're paying and what you're receiving?
not necessarily. We continue to monitor that, but there are instances in which it could basically create basis risk. So currently that's not the case. We continue to see what Congress is doing and what the tax policy is.
What happens when LIBOR goes away? What are you guys thinking?
There are, well beyond the municipal market, there is just such a huge industry of financial products tied to LIBOR that they are going to have to do a very gradual and deliberative move to a new index that's market accepted. So LIBOR will go away and it will be replaced by something. We're not quite sure, but we expect the markets to be well tended to. Because they have to. I mean, there's trillions of dollars of financial products tied to the minority of which is municipal products in the United States. And then lastly is liquidity renewal risk, to your point, every 3 to 5 years. So these are all risks that were presented and discussed at the length in 2005 and continue to sort of manage and monitor. And we highlighted them again because we just simply have to continue to research.
You showed us what the liquidity provider rate fees are. What rate is called for? Is there a max rate inherent in that?
There is a max rate in state law on your variable rate bonds of 12%. And you typically keep any max rate within a liquidity document to the same.
That's your worst case. If the market dries up for remarketing, basically you have to go to the banks to purchase your paper for that period of time. You could go to the default rate of 12%.
Yes. You'd have investors would have to first not want to hold Sandex bonds. We tested that through the Great Recession. They continue to want to hold Sandex bonds. That would have to first happen. You'd have to find no investors interested in holding bonds. You'd then have to draw on the liquidity facility, and then you'd have to be in such a high interest rate environment where it would float up to the max rate, or there would have to be an event.
This is not exactly what happened 8 years ago with variable rate bonds, where everything's not everything. Many of them got the max rates, and you had a lot of municipalities that realized they had no idea what they entered into, paying huge interest rates.
For those that, for those that relied on the liquidity facility, there were some. Typically, most of those folks work out. I mean, if you need to draw the liquidity facility, there's usually a 90 to 180 day window before interest rates begin to kick up under those facilities. And then you usually take that 9 to 3 to 6 month period to refinance and restructure and not sit on that max rate. So I think very few people, at least in my experience, were paying that max rate. It's a theoretical potential, but very few have ever been paying the max rate. In fact, it's sort of the opposite. You still have auction rate securities outstanding because the variable rate is so low. The Fed has kept the variable rate so low. They would have not been incentivized to get out. So that's a very complex discussion, and there may be more questions. Appreciate your time.
Well, I would say, I mean, this is an immensely clear explanation of a very, very complicated subject, so kudos to you. I'm curious, sort of in an off-the-record sense, in your professional judgment after, as excellent a job as you've done here, after going through this, what would you say if you were to give a pop quiz to recipients, like what percentage of recipients would actually pass a pop quiz on this after you've given them?
Good question. I think.
This is not on the record.
Yeah, this is totally this is just for us in the room. We've turned off the tape recorder.
I mean, that's a two-part question. A little bit, so I'm going to hedge. I think very few are going to get the detailed mechanics of this and the nuance. So but I hope, the goal, I think, is to leave folks with 2 or 3 takeaways. How do these things generally work? Why would you use them? How do they generally work? And then what are the risks? And so if you have those 3 elements, even if you don't know if you're a LIBOR index or a SIFMA index or what SBPA is or liquidity provider, then I think then I'd give you a passing grade. If you could say, okay, why am I using this? How do I know if it's working or not? Variable receipts meet my variable payments, and what are the risks? And I think most folks get that. The nuance, to your point, is complicated.
You're just following up. I spent a few minutes this morning reading the article in Voice of San Diego on this in June, and the explanation there was very good. And here, I think Stuart makes a good point. I think it cleared a lot of issues up. I know your next slide says looking ahead. What's with the plan of finance and sort of with the Measure A losing and revenue coming in more and more every month, we're going to get a report here that revenues come in more, higher and higher. What's the plan of finance? How is this all going to impact looking ahead as far as what the plans are in the future here? Because at some point, we need another tax index. Staff said we needed more tax increases to sustain all the work that's coming up. Looking ahead, what's the plan?
The plan that's a bigger question, transcends my.
I mean, I know the plan of finance issue, I have a feeling.
Right, so
and all
I mean,
that. I'm just curious, sort of, we're going back to see what has happened, but going forward,
right.
So revenue has to come in.
So going
here.
forward, I mean, what the plan of finance shows is that there are Transnet funds that are forecast to go into the future and paid for, a number of things. There's also existing sources, state and federal sources that will supplement the Transnet funds. And then there's going to be, an additional, dollar amount, about $8 billion in new fund sources that would be needed between now and 2048 in order to complete all the projects. So even the new fund sources, we consider that assumption to be a reasonable assumption given, how new fund sources have materialized. If you look at the past 20 years or so, it seems like there's one new one every 3 or 4 years. But that's kind of going forward. There's going to be, a need for new fund sources, whether that's sales tax or state or federal, whatever the case may be. At the end of the day, we don't really care. The projects don't really care where it comes from as long as that money, comes in. But there are other existing sources that allow us to, continue to work. I'm not sure if you're looking ahead slide refers to like.
Well, the next video, I'm just saying, whether we, as far as the future swaps and all this, do you anticipate? Again, it's all going to depend on how the revenue is coming in on this side, on how you're going to borrow and all that for all these projects coming in. If we don't have another tax increase, the revenues, I guess I'm sort of, what's going to happen here with all this revenue coming in, but we've got to get projects built.
Right, so looking ahead, I mean, there's Transnet and there's existing revenue sources. SB1, it's a new fund source. It is more competitive in nature, but I think one of the changes that you're going to see in the next, 3 to 5 years or so, our debt finance program is going to be winding down. We're going to be borrowing less over the next 3 to 5 years, and essentially stop borrowing. For the most part, over the next 3 to 5 years, we will have the TIFIA that is locked in
that will be coming in 2021 or so. But in terms of sales tax financings, as we've had in the past, those are going to be winding down, and the program is going to be transitioning to more of a pay-as-you-go. So that's why we're paying attention to, what are the state and federal formula funds that we're getting, as well as the competitive opportunities that are coming up, because all of those are part of the entire package.
As they say another way, to Brad's point, other than the TIFIA loan, essentially, we're out of borrowing capacity, that's it. You say we're winding down.
So as Andre mentioned, so we locked in the TIFIA.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we're going to be looking at next is between now and when we draw down on the TIFIA, we need to borrow some short-term,
It's against the TIFIA.
Essentially, it will be paid for with, yeah.
So other than the TIFIA, you're out of borrowing capacity.
No, there's still a little bit of additional borrowing that we may need to do, but it's not going to be as significant as what it has been in the past.
Two kind of points I wanted to make. If you go to the slide right before. In terms of risks, the board has adopted and have an interest rate swap policy. And so it really steps through, and they get a report on an annual basis that steps through all these risks and where they stand at that point in time. So to provide some comfort, it's not something that we entered into lightly, as you've heard, but we've entered into and we continue to monitor, and there's sort of, eyes on this in terms of the board level and how this is provided. So that's one point. The other point I would make is sort of interesting, because you may ask, like, do we even need this swap? Why would you just enter into interest? If you did variable rate, why would you still need to enter into swaps? We did it to lock in rates going forward, but when we were negotiating the TIFIA loan, one of the points was they wanted to ensure that any variable rate debt that we do have do have swaps. So because it is, as Peter's mentioned, it's a measure of certainty. They know, and they wanted to take that sort of uncertainty off the table. So it's sort of interesting where I know some of the news reports have talked about this as something that you shouldn't enter into, it's high risk. But in the case of the federal government, they really did view this as a way to kind of mitigate risk and provide some certainty in terms of costs.
Follow, is there a risk that the fact that Measure A lost and all that revenue coming in, is there a risk at all this as far as future?
The slide before in terms of the coverage levels, the coverage levels are continue to meet what you promise bondholders you would meet, and the structure of your debt service is still, so it's not, yeah.
So it's not impacted as a result.
We're not relying on Measure A to provide, the coverage levels for the issue, for the debt that we've already issued.
The lenders wouldn't have lent the money.
Pardon?
The lenders would not have lent the money if it was relying on future.
Yes, yeah.
Maybe just I'll take a couple of minutes for the last slide. Looking at bullet number 2 first, that's something we just talked about. Peter did the standby bond purchase agreements for liquidity. Probably we have 3 banks, JP Morgan, State Street, and Mizuho. Mizuho is a Japanese bank. They seem to come in and out of the U.S. market. They've decided that they're moving out. So we're replacing Mizuho with the new bank, Bank of America, for a 3-year term, which is actually below our average. Our average right now is at 36 basis points. We're replacing 35 basis points. Then our Union Bank, we have our commercial paper, kind of similar thing, liquidity facility. We just renewed them for a year. They're a Japanese bank that is staying in the U.S. markets. And then lastly, the SR 125 debt refinancing. What that has to do with this particular, with ITOP, is the fact that there's a commission loan. With the SR 125, there's a TIFIA loan that we inherited when we came out of bankruptcy. That is the bad TIFIA loan that we have, that the rates are approximately 8%, and that was done intentionally for them to make up some of the losses that they incurred when we purchased it. The purchase price that we paid was a lot lower. It impacted their loan. They wanted to get the money on the back end, so they increased the rates. But we've actually managed to talk with the TIFIA office and let them have us prepay the loan, which part of the loan agreement is you could prepay. So we're very pleased because we're going to be replacing it with a alone, which is approximately 3.8%, a lot lower than 8%. Along with that was a commission loan that was 4.25%, $62.5 million that will be repaid to the commission. The whole savings approximately $60 million. And then present value savings, $100 million cash flow savings, and $60 million net present value. And then the $62.5 million, I think Jose talked about at the last meeting, that's going to go to the contingency account for the commission. So we're very excited to do that. And that will probably go to the market next week.
Prepayment penalty on that 8% loan?
Well, I think the 8% loan is pretty high, and I think they realize that just like us, we're a governmental agency, we give it to the public. They realize that we've taken over the toll road for 5 years, we outperformed, and it's something that they realize we could go to the bond market and raise the rates at a lot lower amount. And so I think it was a relationship that we built, in particular, over the last 2.5 years building the Mid-Coast project and getting that loan. We built a relationship with them. And so initially, a year ago was, no, we're going to prepay, this is what it is, but we've actually built this rapport over with them, and so we're pretty excited to get out of that situation.
I'm curious, what's the source of funding for the STIFIA organization agency?
Federal government.
It's the federal government, it's your tax
Huh?
dollars.
Yeah.
What's
federal tax
dollars?
I didn't realize that. It's all my tax dollars. What exactly is it?
Give all the chance of that.
What is the TIFIA program?
And which department?
How did it get created?
USDOT.
How is it funded? What line item in the budget funds the damn thing?
It's through the USDOT, and then the TIFIA program gets an allocation whenever they renew the federal highway legislation. Hopefully every 6 years, but that rarely happens. But whenever they do that, they determine whether they're going to keep the program and how they're going to fund the program, and they fund it through the highway legislation. So they did that in that range of $10 to $12 billion.
It's a federal appropriation that then gets dispersed based on.
According to our swap policy, what's the minimum credit rating for counterparties, and what are the ratings on these 3 institutions that we're working with now?
Yeah, so it's on page 7 of your report. Their existing counterparties.
Sorry.
They're all in that sort of A category or higher. Goldman Sachs is AA, like Bank of America is A.
And so does anybody happen to know if the policy is like is it like a strong single A or just a single A or better kind of thing?
Check every one is quoted. Minimum, these are their existing ratings, and your question is what are the minimum ratings to enter into a new swap policy? I don't think it's AA anymore. Back in the good old days, it used to be AA, but then you really run out of swap counterparties. So I think it's single A. It has to be a single A, but I would have to check.
Just anywhere within the
Yeah, that's what we have.
Couldn't find many banks with AA, that's why.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Great.
That's very good, thank you.
Yeah, excellent, thanks.
I think it took way too much time. I appreciate your indulgence on that.
No, thank you. Okay.
Moving on, number 7, Steve. The RTIP amendment, number 8.
Morning. At its October 27th meeting, the Sandag Board of Directors is scheduled to approve amendment number 8 to the 2016 Regional Transportation Improvement Program. The ITOP is asked to review and discuss the projects included in this proposed amendment, focusing their review on the Transnet funded projects. Amendment number 8, which is the regular scheduled quarterly amendment, is detailed in the discussion section of your report starting on page 2. This portion details the changes for each project, program of Transnet funds, and if applicable, provides the amount changed in funding. In attachment 1 of your backup, beginning on page 8, you will find the changes proposed with this amendment specifically for those projects funded with Transnet funding at the top, followed by other funding program of the project. Attachment table 2, as shown on page 50, provides the cumulative capacity analysis in regard to revenue versus program of Transnet Local Street Improvement, or LSI funds, through Amendment Number 8 for all agencies. Attachment 3, which begins on page 51, is the new RTIP Amendment Change Report, which lists the total project cost, the revised project cost for each project, and also the cost and percent difference. And attachment 4 includes a map showing the major transportation projects included in this amendment. Any specific questions on projects included?
Were there any comments during the comment?
There were no comments received from the public. Many of the local changes were due to budgets being passed by the cities, and also we had asked many of them to correct their projects for the reduced revenues that we had given them in February, so they revised their programming to be within their revised revenues.
There obviously is a tremendous amount of detail that you folks have to keep track of and move things around, but is there any showstoppers that you should be pointing our attention to specifically where they're particularly problematic or unique or something other than the general run-of-the-mill stuff you have to process the report?
I wouldn't say in that report, in this report. I think the only two projects that I've included the detail about because of the coming funds is Oceanside and Lemon Grove added SB1 funds to their projects. And so that is something that more agencies will begin to do as they get their list of projects approved for the SB1 Local Street and Road Program. You'll start to see that they're not required to program it unless it's being added to a project in the object.
Just a crazy question. On page 9 on direct access ramp on I-805, and some of these projects are already completed. Maybe I'm still confused a little bit about sort of the funding mechanisms on what it says 16, 17, 17, 18, 18, 19, 19, 20. The project's been completed, correct?
Right, it's been open to traffic, but there's a lot of projects that have like plan establishment. And so you need to have an annual amount for during the plan establishment period for the landscaping portion of the project.
So the project, even though it's open to traffic and all that,
right,
there's ongoing projects
correct,
associated
yes,
with going on right now, and that's the funding. That's interesting because when you look at it, when you drive up there, it looks like it's done.
Right. Well, it's done for cars.
For cars, but then when it comes
the
to
plants are still
plants and issues like that.
Right.
Thank you.
In the case of the SR 94-125 southbound eastbound on page 10, the huge decrease in that project of this CRP funds. How long is Transnet allocated to this project before you say, well, there's nothing on the schedule for this project to be done? Do we transfer those funds out, or is that up to the municipality to shift the funds to another?
This is the Caltrans project. The Transnet that's on the project has already incurred. There's nothing currently programmed, but the project is still needs to be designed, and so we'll be looking for funds.
Yeah, this is actually a Transnet project. It's one of your Transnet major corridors projects. The change here is that you'll notice the TCRP congestion relief program, I think it's called. It's a program that was created back in the early 2000s, and with SB1, the program was essentially sunset. It was, completed, and so any projects that had not received funding, essentially those funds just went away. So that's what we needed to unprogram those dollars. But the project remains part of the Transnet set of projects, and so we'll be looking for opportunities now through SB1 to fund SB1 or other funding sources to finish the project. The project does have a completed environmental document, and so the next phase of work would be final design and right of way, and then on to construction.
It's not our job to tell anybody how to spend their money, but page 39, SD 96.
Yes.
Do you have any idea, and we can ask City of San Diego next month when they get here, do you have any idea why they're cutting almost 10% of the millions of dollars set aside for street resurfacing?
They didn't indicate any detail in the project itself, only that all of the adjustments that they made were part of their 2018 budget that was passed in July.
Yes.
Most of the big bulk of the changes in this project are in the outer years, 19 through 21. So I don't know really what their plans are.
Okay, I think they'll be here and we will ask them. Perhaps they feel their streets no longer need to be resurfaced as much.
Terminology wise, Johnson uses the term resurfacing. Does that comprehend pothole repair?
No, pothole repair is maintenance. This is resurfacing. This is congestion relief.
So
1 inch or more.
greater than 1 inch.
Well, potholing is maintenance, I believe.
Yeah.
That's the 30%.
That's the 30%, yes.
Resurfacing is
seal.
70%?
It's in the congestion relief.
If it's greater than 1 inch overlay.
As long as the pavement thickness that you're adding is greater than 1 inch, then it's considered part of the 70%.
Conceptually, how is that reducing congestion?
Well, the idea is that if you
Sounds
have...
like a pity of maintenance if the surface life
Right.
only has a life to it.
Right, no, I think the idea is that for some of the projects that have greater thickness, you are improving the facility, you might be doing some ancillary work in addition to just the resurfacing. There's a number of just performance reasons for that.
This is the ultimate pothole repair is resurfacing. If I get enough potholes because I haven't got to it, I'm going to resurface it.
I think a pothole repair is a temporary fix, whereas resurfacing is supposed to have a longer life.
And
That would
the
make it
maintenance
congestion
projects are like slurry seal and patching, right?
No.
I thought the original concept of the ordinance was to differentiate between maintenance, and the theory was we didn't want to eliminate municipalities' ongoing requirements to do their own maintenance, and the bulk of the money was going to be for something that was enhancing something. And that's why I'm intrigued with resurfacing is enhancing something as distinct from repair. This is real stretch. That's always been the operating definitions that were established up front by somebody.
It's detailed in the ordinance for which projects are considered congestion relievers.
It's a little simpler to understand than swapping. Interest rate swaps.
You want to go back to the flops?
I want to go back to the swaps.
I do have a question on, let's see, this is page 38, but explained on page 6, the SR 163 Friars Road interchange.
Yes.
They had higher than expected construction bids, so they're increasing their Transnet funds by 2.9 million. How can they just add Transnet funds? Is that just meaning they took it from another project, or they applied? Because I'm just thinking of a project I know of in Otay. We would love to increase $3 million into Transnet. How does that work?
The
I don't know if
city,
that's the
the
same
city
thing.
has a set amount of revenue that they're given, and their job is to spread it around these
So
projects.
they took it from another project and put it in here. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that could have been the case. Like, another case is sometimes they leave, or they have unprogrammed, they just haven't programmed all of their funds to projects, and so they have an unprogrammed balance, and so they could take some of that unprogrammed balance and apply to a project like this one.
Like I took it off street resurfacing.
Yeah.
Other questions? Ernie?
Number 8, Lisa.
Yes. Okay, similar to Andre's item, this was scheduled for presentation last month, but we didn't make a meeting, so here we are again. This information is for June 30th, so it is a little stale. Next month, we'll be providing the September 30th data. So I'm going to go, because this is the June 30th, I typically go through each attachment to provide some detail and answer any questions that you may have. I'm going to take them out of order a little bit so that I can respond to some questions that I received in advance towards the end. I would like to start with attachment 3, which is our estimated annual sales tax revenue compared to the actual receipts. So our top section is going to show us the annual from fiscal year 2009 through 17, our estimates and our actuals. And we did end the year good standing at 3.25% over the prior year. Our section at the bottom provides us a snapshot of fiscal year 17 by month, our estimate to the actuals. Once again, we did come in a little bit over the estimates, and these were the adjusted estimates. The center section, or paragraph here, we do not provide that for 3 of the 4 quarters, but at June 30th, this paragraph is added, and it provides some information taking the 2002 estimate and how it looks today. If there are any questions on that, we have Jim Miller, our senior economist, with us here that can provide responses to the paragraph. Yes.
The annual, on the upper chart, the annual forecast versus prior year, based on what happened with the estimates on the election issues and all that, those have been adjusted, right? What number was adjusted down as a result of the estimates that you all did from 2000?
You're talking about the forecast?
Yeah, well, wasn't one of these adjusted down as a result of the estimate, the revenue estimates?
The forecast report?
Yeah, no,
Am I looking at the wrong chart, though?
Yeah, the annual, these are just the annual Transnet
revenue
estimates. So the estimate was, we typically look at it through midpoint throughout the year. So in December, we say, okay, well, what's happened half of the year? Do the estimates look as though they're not going to change? Or should we adjust it because it has been coming perhaps slower than we anticipate? And I do believe we did an adjustment.
We got a question. You're thinking about the long-term projection.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what was changed based upon the consensus outlook, So that's what the long-term projections of Transnet to the year 2038. What this focuses on is the actual receipts in the budget year.
Okay.
So as we get into a new budget year, an estimate is made, and so because we need to give these numbers also to the cities and the transit operators because they use them for their own, budget year estimates. And so we provide that before the budget year starts. But midway through, we look at all the receipts that we've gotten to date from the PLE and either keep them the same, or adjust it. And so the last couple of years we have been doing these mid-year corrections in the budget year.
So it's dropping from 3.5 to 2.62%. It's on the far right corner. Is that what that number, actual forecast, is being dropped down?
That's on past history, doesn't comprehend the forecasting adjustment for the future.
But just to answer the question, for last year, we had budgeted 3.5%. And when we looked at the number, like Kim said, in December, it looked like they were coming lower, so we adjusted it down to a 2.6% level. But we were kind of pleasantly surprised that the year looked fairly strong, and we ended up at 3.25%. So that was just below our initial projection of 3.5%.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's move on to attachment 4. And this is taking a look at the ITOPS budget, the budget to the actuals. Even though everything that's being provided today is based on the unaudited June 30th, this is, I think, very close to the actual the final numbers for the ITOX budget. The actual spending is the $100,853 in total, which provides you a savings of $26,500, which is great, because then that just becomes part of your carryover for future years, where you wouldn't have to tap into all of your annual allocation if you did not wish to. I did add a new line at the very bottom of this table, the estimated annual funds at June 30th, 2017, taking the carryover unused at the beginning of the year with the unspent budgeted amount now provides you the $181,000 carryover for future years.
I'd like to make a motion, since we're underrunning our budget and we have this 108, we grant ourselves a significant salary increase.
5%, correct? Which percent?
I want to ask a question going back to attachment 3 in the middle of the page. I don't really know what the relevance is of this on what you guys are doing, but kind of in the middle of the paragraph where you say that the actual revenue received in 2002 is 23% below the estimated amount through fiscal year 2017. Does that matter right now? I mean, are you guys looking at, I mean, you guys are in good financial position, but what is the consequence of that, if you will?
So our current plan of finance already takes into account that lower number.
Okay.
And so in terms of our budgets are built based on that lower Transnet number plus the supplemental state and federal funds.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't affect our current budget because it's already taking into account that lower number.
I think this is something that people have consistently asked us. It's like, if you had your snapshot in time when you did the transit ordinance at the $14 billion roughly, where are you in relation to that? And so this is a calculation. This is based upon receipts, and then, making sure you're doing apples to apples in terms of the year, just giving us a snapshot in time. I don't know, we don't use this for any kind of future thing. It's an information point that the ITOC has requested.
It's implicitly used in everything you do.
It's implicitly used, but it's
It
not.
is what it is.
Yeah.
But that does affect the projects.
No, not really, because
Over time, this will affect the projects.
over time, yes, I think, the Great Recession hit right when the thing started. So, we talked a lot about, we actually didn't see as bad of a hit because the prices went down significantly, right? So even though you got a 20% to 25% hit in revenue, your actual construction prices came down. So we were still able to kind of do a lot during that time. But this is just, it's one point in time, it's only one half of the equation, right?
It's a real problem. It's a disservice to all you guys when people focus on them about all the rest of America.
Right.
You just quoted one cost work out at the same time. It's a little more complicated for people to understand. They can grasp that, the shortfall there, what was us?
Because I do remember there was a chart at some point a few months ago where you showed that you actually didn't lose that much because the cost of construction went down. Cost of construction went down so much. So I just, in my mind, I was like, that surprised me because I thought you had caught up with the construction costs. So.
Right, and this is just one piece of the revenue
Right.
equation. There's other state and federal funds that, back in 2002, they were not anticipated. If you think about the dollars that came to the region right after the recession, Proposition 1B, stimulus, a number of others. Those are part of the equation, and they supplemented Transnet back when Transnet was actually, going down. But these were supplementing the rest of the program.
So is this paragraph useful? Going forward, is this paragraph useful then? To leave it in or take it out?
Pretty much just for our benefit, correct?
It's a fact. If you extend any public reading, and you probably need another sentence there. to explain there's overwhelming other variables.
Well, the revenue every year has gone up, right, the last 6 years. It's up to 284 million, 5.26. So that's a good news, but then that doesn't say that it's down 23%. $2,002, is that right? How I read that? Right.
I mean, I urge you to really consider that too much focus on this number. It's the wart and the
No, I think it's
dog,
good.
as I've said.
The fact that we're
many times.
receiving more money every year is good news, right? 200, but then again, it's down.
The total equation, this is about 25% on the revenue side, not to speak of the cost side. It gets so much attention.
Yeah, I think you could add the cost side percentage in there. You say it's not sufficient to offset all the fall in sales tax revenue, but you don't always say where that leaves you. So for me, just reading this, it's not entirely clear, but.
Yeah, I mean, but it's not even that the cost savings have really made up for it. It's as you were saying, that, in my mind, when I read this, what jumps out is, yes, this is just one number, one revenue number. And so it begs the question of, did we outperform in the other sources of revenue? And you're saying that we did. And so it's like, I understand why it's kind of some interest to some people to look at this one data point, but I don't know, it seems like the real story is Dick keeps reminding us, is that this is only like, a quarter, a third of the total revenue, and so why talk about this and not the rest of the picture? And then on top of that, in relation to construction costs, so.
I think we provide that bigger picture on a number of other occasions, right? There are annual reports on finance.
The rest of the story is more complicated. This is a very simple thing, and people latch onto it, but it's misleading still. So either you eliminate it or you try to put some additional words to put it in context. You don't need people to focus on this number by itself. It doesn't do you any good whatsoever.
Were there any questions on attachment 4? Budget council. Okay. So we can move to attachment 5. So what we're looking at here is within our local street road, the LSI program, as we kind of with our RTIP just talked about briefly, we have our maintenance piece versus our congestion relief. So here we're just looking at the 30% of the LSI funding, our maintenance. We have to ensure that the jurisdictions do not spend more than 30% of their funding cumulatively on maintenance projects as per the ordinance. So that's what this is telling us right here. We have our funds allocated in column C, totals of A and B, and then we have what's been expended as of June 30th, column B. So what that means there is that this is what SANDAC has paid to the jurisdiction plus program fees. It's not an actual invoice paid by a local jurisdiction, but whatever we've provided to them is with the intent that it will be used for that purpose. And then we have our total balance, column E. So this is what has been unspent to date, right? And we're ensuring that column E is 0 or above. It's not negative. If it's negative, then they've spent more than 30%. What column F is telling us is how much cash do we actually have available for their projects. And it is different from the prior column because the ordinance also tells us that they can spend more than 70% on their congestion relief projects. So if they do, then even if looking at what they could spend on maintenance, we might not have the cash available because they spent some of that cash on their congestion relief projects. So any of the jurisdictions that have a bold number in column F would tell you that there's less cash available than what they could use on maintenance because they're spending more on congestion relief, which is fine. These are just things that we track every month when the jurisdictions ask us for funding for their maintenance projects, make sure that they're 0 or above, that they're not going below 30% cumulatively, and that we have cash available to pay them.
But it's cumulative, so
Cash available.
if they surge on improvements, they can catch up on the 30% maintenance later on.
Absolutely. Yes, yes, it is a cumulative. Okay. So moving on to attachment 6, now we're looking at the grant programs for Transnet. So we have our bike and pedestrian, which is also called the Active Transportation Grant Program. We have our Smart Growth, our local environmental mitigation program, and our senior mini grant program. So first we're looking at the revenues received. We have this broken out because for 2 of the programs, our bike ped and our local EMP, there are some of the funds that are used for non-grant, they're regional projects. So we want to call that out, otherwise it looks odd that, oh, you've collected 48 million, but you're only awarding 19 for the grants. And so we wanted to throw that other figure out there to give you a bigger picture. And then we have, off to the right, we have our grantee expenditures to date and our unspent committed. And these are all requests of the ITAP over time. For the senior mini grant, under column column C, for the awarded grant, you'll notice that it's in excess of what's been received through the end of the fiscal year. And that's because they award the grants based on the estimates, and sometimes they look forward a little bit. But it all catches up in the end. Ultimately, we cannot pay more than cash available. It always comes down to that.
Why wouldn't you apply that with the other programs then, or why do you apply it only with this program?
It's up to each grant program and how they administer. You ready to move on? Okay. So if I could bring you back to attachment 1. And I'll just go through this briefly, and then I did receive some questions, and I'll come back and respond to the questions. So this is kind of a snapshot of the activity for the quarter, fiscal year, and then program to date by program, and then the annually allocated recipients. As always, we have our revenues on the left. We have our sales tax allocations, our Transnet allocation is called out specifically. Our other income, which is a compilation, to give us our total. Then we have our fund disbursements. We have our program disbursements, which are the payments to the local agencies, as well as program costs. Then we have our debt service to give us our totals. Then on the next page, we also include our commercial paper program activity. The left side, we're going to show you all of the recipients since the inception of the extension ordinance and what has been paid to them over time. Then to the right is the more current information, so that we have our $75 million program. Currently, if you look at the program to date column, you'll see that we only have NCTV currently with an outstanding amount in the program. La Mesa made their final payment for their outstanding amount during fiscal year 17. Oceanside, they have zero balance because we have an agreement with them, and you'll actually see with the September data that we'll bring back to you next month that they have received their first reimbursement on commercial paper. And then at the beginning of the fiscal year, prior to the issuance of the 2016 bonds, we had some commercial paper that had been borrowed and then paid down with the issuance of the bonds for our major corridor and our major corridor EMP programs. And then our other activity down there at the bottom is the borrowing between the major corridor EMP is borrowing major corridor funds to pay down debt service, and this was an expected use of revenues when the ordinance was implemented, because it was expected that the EMP program would be acquiring the land needed for the program towards the beginning of the program if the cost analysis told us that it was a better deal at that point, which they did. And then on our last page of this report is a snapshot of our different bond issuances that we have, the jurisdictions that have borrowed against them, and the funds that have been, the proceeds that have been paid to them or on their behalf. So currently we have proceeds outstanding, available to be paid with our 2014 bonds for the city of Santee. And I believe they expect during fiscal year 18 to draw the balance of that. And then our 2016 bonds, we have our major corridor and the EMP program still drawing against the 16 bonds. So if I can have you go back to page 1, I did receive some questions that I would like to address. So the first question was, and this is all related to the major corridor line, which is the 4th program listed. So the first question was negative $65 million in the other income. What does this include? So there are a couple of different things in here. The largest being, back in fiscal year 2009, there was a swap of the ARA funds with the local jurisdictions, and those had to be shovel-ready projects in order to, I believe, receive the funds. And not all the jurisdictions had projects ready, but we did with our major corridor program. So there was an agreement to swap those funds. We gave up $50 million in Transnet to the local jurisdiction. So while you see it as a negative here, it actually became a positive within all of the local jurisdictions, the one-to-one offset, and we took their ARA funds. So there was no loss in revenue, it was just the revenue type that switched.
Does that get switched back?
No, it was a swap.
It was just, yeah.
Yeah, which the ordinance allows for swaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, which the ordinance allows. What we did was, the federal dollars, the stimulus money that came to the region would have subjected all 18 cities in the county plus Sandag to really rigorous kind of reporting requirements for the feds. And so rather than have everyone having to subject themselves, we consolidated all the ARA funds and gave them a like amount of Transnet funds. So they're used to reporting on Transnet. We have the audits that you do on the agencies to ensure that they're used the right way. But it was truly just a one-for-one swap to reduce the
administrative burden.
Yeah, administrative burden on the cities, and so.
Trying to internalize it. If the ordinance said X% is supposed to go to major projects, and you did a swap, so you removed some of that X% allocation to something over here. How do you ever achieve the X% for total of the major projects at the end of the day?
It's still counted because it's allowed for swaps and exchanges of funds are allowed, as long as you hold the one-to-one.
So essentially, the dollars, you've got different programs. You've got your major corridors program, and you've got your local streets and roads program. So $50 million of Transnet dollars.
Excuse me, before you did it, doesn't the ordinance specify what percentage goes to each one of those line
Yes,
items?
that's right. Yes, and so a portion, $50 million of the total dollars that go to the major corridors, went to major corridors. But what the proposal was then to take that $50 million and exchange it with the locals who were getting the federal stimulus dollars. So the federal stimulus came this way, and the Transnet came this way. So the major corridors element that gave up the Transnet dollars was made whole with the federal dollars.
And as far as the ordinance is concerned, you're able to manipulate line items like that, different sources, and still comply with the ordinance.
Exchanges are allowed as long as the program is made whole by receiving other.
So at the end of the day, if you just look at Transnet funds, it will show that you'll be short for this line item by $50 million, but it was compensated by other revenue.
Correct.
We also had prior to the onset of the extension ordinance, several of the major corridor and major corridor EMP projects moved forward. And most of those projects were funded using commercial paper, which then when we issued the 2008 bonds, we took down the commercial paper. But there was also some use of our old Transnet $1. And so what we did was when the extension ordinance came into play, we moved those Transnet $1, the spending, over to 2. So that was 14 million of the Transnet 1 sales tax that had been used. And so we had to move that burden over to the extension because that's where it really belonged, and it freed up our old sales tax to be used for our old highways program. There was another, now on page 2, we had, and you can, the numbers are a little, yeah, I have it right. The $17.2 million of the program to date, other activity. That's the. It's actually this number has changed since this report was written. It's closer to 18 million. When I looked at it yesterday.
What were you referring to?
I'm sorry, page 2 on other activity at the bottom, the other activity section. Program to date. Oh, I'm sorry, the second page. The second page of this report. Page 4? Yeah, page 4. The second page of the report. Page 4, 1.
It's just numbered differently
Yes.
when the
Yeah.
whole packet is put
Yeah.
together, but
I'm
page
sorry.
4.
Page 4. In the other activity section, this is, I mentioned this earlier, where the major corridor EMP program is borrowing the major corridor dollars to cover debt service. So that would be part of it. It would show here. And then we have our offsets. There's a little bit of other income that came in. We have some Caltrans rent that comes into this other income, proceeds from land sales that we've received, and there's also some interest income. So all of that combined makes up this negative $65 million in the other income. That would be on the first page of your attachment, page 3. The next question that I had
Can you
was.
point out where the negative 65 million is, please?
It's on page 3 of the attachment 1. It's on the front of attachment 1, page 3 of the report. So the next question was, we're looking at the same line, the major corridor capital projects line on the first page of attachment 1, under the debt service section. There's a negative 651 million. So how is this derived? Probably 95% of that is principal and interest on our bonds, principal and interest payments on the bonds. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, now we're kind of looking at the line as this whole section of major corridor. So the allocation to date is $817 million. The major corridor disbursements is about $2 billion, and the total disbursements is about $2.7 billion. So the question is, if you're doing the math, is it correct to assume that the $2.7 billion spent to date, but we received the $817 million in sales tax, then we've taken the difference, the negative $1.9 billion from future sales tax? Yeah, that's pretty accurate.
Now, what I was doing, and see if I've got this wrong, and I know this is not precise, because sales tax ranges escalate with inflation and everything. If the ordinance is allocated based on the revenue, total revenue received, some $800 million for the last 8 years.
Right.
Ballpark, $100 million a year.
Yep.
We have borrowed effectively $1.9 billion. At $100 million a year, that's 19 years worth of future revenues that won't pour concrete. Those taxpayers won't get anything for their taxes for that line out of the ordinance.
Well, but you have to also look at the repayment schedules. So we're not we're not taking every dollar that comes in to put towards that service.
I'm aggregating,
Yeah.
you
Right,
won't
right.
consume every year's.
Right,
money.
right, and I did look at that part of your question, and, I looked at it a couple of different ways. I said, well, what are the actual revenues that we've received today? So if I take that, and then I say, well, and, based on, a 2.5% or 3% growth from fiscal year 17, would it really be 19 years to make
It'd
up
be less
that?
than that.
It's close to it. It's between 18 and 19. So yeah, it's, it's there. And then if you keep going out further, it actually brings it down a little bit less than. But you're pretty close. You're pretty right on
I just
target.
like to
Yeah.
keep playing this broken record.
Right. Right.
I'm speaking for my grandkids now.
Right. Well, yeah. I won't speak for them. Okay, so those were the questions.
They're gonna want Transnet monies to deal with driverless cars
Right.
and possibly flying Ubers.
That'll be our next
There
ordinance.
ain't gonna be any money for that.
Okay, and
That will happen.
I have one more attachment if we don't have any further questions on this. Okay.
Attachment two.
So we have attachment 2.
Okay.
So attachment 2, for June 30th, it always looks a little different than in the other 3 quarters. We start off on our left, we have our cumulative actual revenues received through the end of the fiscal year. Column B, for the 3 other quarters, we actually have numbers here because column A, we're going to take our cumulative through that quarter, but then we always have some estimated that we haven't collected yet. So we try to give a full picture of what we're expecting the year to look like. But here, we're at the end of the year, so there are no more estimates, right? We only have our actuals. So then we say, okay, well, what's actually been paid out to date? And that would be our cumulative dispersed. Then we look at, well, what does SANDAG have on the books? What do we have remaining for each of these jurisdictions? And we reach out to the jurisdictions and ask them to provide their numbers as well to come up with our total, what we're calling cash balances. Then we're going to do our analysis and we say, well, what's the actual cumulative spent here? What's our percentages? So our column G would be that old threshold that the ITOP was interested at 60%, and we had the city of Carlsbad and Escondido that, based on that threshold, did not meet. Everybody else was doing pretty well there. Then we move over a little bit, and this is another place where it looks a little odd because the RTIP, the programming, is a biennial element, right? So it's a 2-year. So we're in the first year of a 2-year period. So we still have all this programming left for the next year, for fiscal year 18, but we're not really counting those revenues at this point when you look at this as a whole. So when we look at our next column, our column I, we have all these negatives. We're saying, well, they're over programming. Well, not necessarily, because we're not looking at apples to oranges, right? We're looking at the actuals, the financial data based on revenues received and costs incurred through fiscal year 17, but we're looking at programming through fiscal year 18. So when you see your September 30th, it's going to look a little bit better because now we're going to be looking at apples to apples, and that's always the case in the second year of the biennial. And then, so column J, once again, it's going to look odd. Everybody's over-anticipating because of the programming, the 2-year programming period. So column K, so let's focus on column K. This is really where your focus is going to be. This is telling us who, at the end of the fiscal year, has spent at least 75%. That's the threshold that the ITOC is focused on. And most have done pretty well. We have 4 that are below the threshold: Carlsbad, Coronado, Encinitas, and Escondido. And they have all provided a letter, which is part of the attachments, of explanation. The city of Encinitas, the individual who normally would provide the explanation has been on vacation, and so they looked back at the last letter sent, which was at the end of fiscal year 16, And they said, you know, the reasons are still the same, and so they requested just to continue using that same letter. In the future, they will update it, should they be in the same situation. So do you have any questions on this? Yes.
I guess my question is not so much a financial one, but more of a kind of, I don't know, what do we call it, programmatic or relationship with the entities. You know, typically these letters say the kinds of things that they say, which is, well, we've got a whole bunch of stuff, and so we expect we'll get under the threshold in a few years. I'm wondering, and again, this isn't specifically a financial question, so I don't know who's best to address this. Is it reasonable to ask for something a little bit more like, by when do you actually expect you will get to the 75% or better threshold, as opposed to just sort of the vague, sometime in the future
No,
we
absolutely.
expect to?
This is presented, this attachment is actually presented to our CTAC, the cities and county.
Transportation advisory.
Prior to coming to the ITAC, and that's when we ask those that are below the 75% to provide an explanation in writing, or to show up and have a verbal discussion with you. Absolutely. I could ask them to expand on their reasoning and to provide something more definitive.
Yeah, and then I would just, to make this chart more kind of complete and impactful, to the extent that you do, then I would maybe add a footnote next to the, for lack of a better term, the offending cities, to say, for example, you know, City of Carlsbad expects to get within the threshold by year X and Y.
Okay.
It's not an unreasonable thing, again, to ask them to.
And if we were to do that, it would be what we call a blue sheet every quarter, because the timing of the meeting is the day after mail out. Their meeting is the Thursday prior to yours.
Okay.
So by the time I receive the letter, it's typically 2 days before this meeting.
Okay. Well, the footnote on the page isn't as meaningful, but it would just be helpful that it not just be this sort of almost, you know, standard, yeah, we'll get to it in a few years kind of thing. Right?
Absolutely.
If you look at the City of San Escondido's letter on here, it's very, I mean, the fact she puts in Director of Engineering that they're at 54% expenditure, funding, and then she explains exactly how they're going to spend the money. I mean, I think this is one of the ones that it's impressive.
Good example.
Good example.
And Lisa, I'm not satisfied with City of Encinitas just giving us last year's letter.
Yeah.
You'd think they could have updated how much they have spent this year, or what they, just giving us a year-old letter that still talks about the next 3 years. Somebody, I'm sorry this guy was on leave, but vacation, but somebody else could have signed the letter. Give it to the mayor to sign. Would you at least tell, what do? You want to call them and tell them that we'd like an updated letter, or?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I can contact them.
I mean, we work hard at these meetings, and you'd think they could give us a fresh letter, even if it's an old excuse.
I'm not following the difference in the J and the K. So you're showing that in column A, this is the amount received through this year. And column J does not take into account next year's funds as well. So like if the construction project hasn't started yet and they're only in the design phase or something, and they're expending a lot more money next year, this takes into account the whole budget for that. I mean, explain to me, I guess, again, if you don't mind, why isn't it just presented as, or is that column K the actual, and if that's the case, the 3 cities or 4 that are, or 5, that are over 100%, what do we do about those?
The ones that are over 100% are, they have borrowed against our bonds or commercial paper, And so they've advanced the projects. And so it's expected that they're going to be over 100% because it's in addition to their annual allocations.
Well, let's be careful not to confuse column G over 100% with column J, because you were initially asking about column J, right?
Yeah, well, K at the end.
Okay.
The ultimate allocation.
Okay, sorry,
The
K, yeah.
ultimate amount spent is, if it's higher, they've bonded, sorry.
Right, so they have advanced their funding to work on projects now. There would have been a cost savings to work on those projects now.
Okay, so column G, the ones under 100%, those are over 100%, those are the ones that have borrowed. When you get to J, the reason why nearly all of these are 100% is what Lisa's saying is that you're not including, you're dividing by A plus B. So A is what you've actually collected for fiscal year 17, B is zero here. But you're not including future FY18 dollars in that denominator, so that's why those are 100%. And then the actual spending rates.
That's not a very meaningful column.
Yeah, I was like, I don't really know why you have it.
For which one, for J?
For J.
Yeah,
Well, at the year end, it's not, but during the course of the year, it gives you a better indication.
It makes a lot of sense. And also in this, because the programming is a 2-year period, so these numbers are coming from the RTIP, and they're not split between year 1 and year 2 of the 2-year period, but fiscal year 17 is year 1. So you're kind of looking at apples and oranges. You're saying, well, we're programming for a 2-year period, but we're only looking at revenues from a 1-year period. And so, yeah, it looks like they've all overspent, or they've overcommitted the revenues, but they really haven't.
So for the purposes of the year end, this is not a meeting, J is not a meeting.
Yeah, and we can collapse that in the future, just not include that, absolutely.
Lisa?
Yeah.
I always struggle with this chart for
Okay.
some of the reasons that have already been expressed, but if we look at the city of San Diego, which is a typical discussion point, and I think this is one of the more important roles we're supposed to be playing. The person sitting on 805 and the commute is frustrated as hell that they don't really look for any instant relief, but the people that hit the potholes all the time are really frustrated and can't understand why there isn't instant relief. If I take San Diego, this tells me, and correct me if I'm wrong, in column D delta, that San Diego has sitting in your bank account $33 million that they haven't asked for. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And then we beat them up before in the past, and I think they've gotten very clever. So now, if I understand this programming concept, they tell you, I'm planning on spending it.
Yeah.
End of story. I'm planning on spending it, trust me, and therefore everything's copacetic. The real question is, okay, there's $33 million that they haven't taken from you. There's, whatever the difference is, there's 240 that they have taken. How much of the 240 has been spent? And when I use the word spent, based on our previous discussions, it becomes very clear that this is not a simple concept. In my mind, they draw the money. The second step is they got a plan, they got an engineer, and they got to go through an RFP procurement, all of which takes time. Then they got to have an actual commitment of money. And then they finally spend it. So when I ask how much have they spent, it begs the question of there's a lot of activities that have to predate that. But I have no way of knowing what really exists. I know they haven't taken $33 million. And my first reaction is every time I hit that bump, it really ticks me off. The next thing is all the money they have taken. I have no idea how much sitting there that they haven't really got anywhere near through their, whatever they call it, their programming exercise to actually convert concepts into pavement, into pothole repairs. How do we see that? When they come over here, they
Well, column G
song and dance and
column G purports to show what has been actually spent, which is separate from programs.
Column G.
Right?
Right, yeah. And they're not, I mean, and column E is going to be what they're sitting on, so they've actually, they haven't requested everything that they should have for the year. They have another.
I understand Stuart's point. Column G takes San Diego again, and they're 87%.
Or Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong, but my interpretation of column G is that it represents what has actually been spent.
Yeah, 87.
Spent, not including what's sitting in cash at their agency. Spent is spent.
Right.
And just so, of
Yeah,
that
that
240
is
million that they've drawn from you,
Mhm.
you believe they have spent 87 of that, which is like 200 million in round number? They've spent that, the potholes been spent?
Yep. Well,
Spent.
not potholes, no, but.
Oh, well, look, spent.
Yes, it's spent, yes, correct. Right, and you'll see that more when we present, I mean, it's gonna be several months from now, but when we present the annual audits. We actually provide all the reports, so you can see the details of different projects, and there's the congestion relief broken out by the maintenance, and you can see the activity for the year.
13% of 24, so that's what, about $30 million that hasn't been spent, but it could well be fully committed.
It could be, it could be committed, absolutely.
And the city's scheduled to come in next month to give you
I
your.
know, I sat through that before. Okay, so that's Stuart's right, and I'm not appreciating it.
Well, but you're right. I mean, you look at column H and look at how big of a number they say is programmed. And this is the question we all have. It's like, do some places just play a game with, they're saying it's programmed, but they never quite get to spend it, intentionally or otherwise.
But I'm trying to reconcile that, and you're enlightening me that 87% you're saying has been spent.
Yes.
Well, the number, it's just because the amount allocated to the city of San Diego is so huge. $33 million is still just 13%.
Still sitting there.
Yeah.
But the 87 has been spent, and then you're saying, what column is it? Column H then is $65 million.
Programmed,
right, but that's over a 2-year period, so they're taking into account their FY18
That has
revenues.
remaining 15% that's been pushed over there, plus whatever they expect to get from you next year. So my only criticism is the 33 million.
And they'll be here next.
Why haven't they drawn it?
You can ask them that at the next meeting. They will be here.
That's not your question.
Yes, okay, I can't.
I understand your
I'll respond to that.
So I actually have a question that relates to this spent, unspent, program and all that stuff. It kind of really goes more to Kim, though. In the context of the 10-year review, right, which is an opportunity to, in effect, rewrite the rules if you get, is it a 2/3 vote of the board to actually change something that was specified? Well, tell me if this is just politically unacceptable, but is there any notion that might be on the table at all of sort of a use it or lose it kind of concept in relation to some of these kinds of things? Does anybody even remotely think that introducing that?
What would be the definition of use it, drawing it from them and then having it sit in their bank account?
The intent of the ordinance is to maximize, right, the use of outside funds, really, so to leverage to the extent possible. So I think that's kind of the intent of the ordinance, it's written in there.
Well,
But we go through this process.
and so you're introducing another concept, which is that spending Transnet funds sometimes isn't the priority because of all the outside funds that have shorter time frames on them.
Absolutely.
Kind of thing.
And we see that sometimes in the annual audit, some of the notes to the projects, there might be some large balance available, and we would say, okay, well, you have to give us a reason why, and they'll say, oh, we ended up getting this state funding, so we're going to use that before we're going to use our Transnet. Now we're going to reprogram our Transnet for something else. So that would be, an unspent dollar.
It makes the Transnet dollar go further stretch for it.
I think Stuart, we get back to the same issue as use it or lose it. What constitutes using it? Programming it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or if they know they have a very large project, 5 years down the line, they might be holding on to their Transnet until that time. They don't want a bond now, they just want to do pay-as-you-go. So let's collect all of this, and we'll have to keep writing a letter to the ITOC until we're at that point.
Right.
It could be something like that.
We've mentioned this before, but it might, I don't know how you do this, but the thing that would get the public's attention is somehow to publicly report on some routine basis, and you're picking on the city of San Diego again, There's $33 million waiting to be asked for of your taxpayers' money that you've already paid to work on your streets. And just have that in the headlines. Voice of San Diego, you're good friends over here, they'd love to publish that.
Well, we have tried to highlight that in the annual report a bit more than in the past, but.
No one, the readership of that is not the same as some of the other documents.
It sounds like we're
I think
planning
what
on
we've heard
becoming
from,
leaguer.
I think what we've heard from cities like San Diego is that, you know, Transnet, as you say, doesn't really have a use it or lose it time frame. Other sources do. And so in order to not lose the other fund sources, they use those first, and essentially that puts Transnet last. Not every time, but sort of programmatically. I mean, that's what City of San Diego has reported to us in the past.
But that implies that there's a limited demand, or there's a limited ability to execute simultaneously. People would argue there's an unlimited demand for repairs of the streets.
Right.
And if the city says, well, I don't have the capability, well, I've heard city staff say, oh, there's not enough contractors in San Diego to do the work. And it boggles my mind that maybe I would win that business.
Right. And I think it'll be interesting to see how, you know, with SB1, there's a significant amount of money going to the cities for, you know, maintenance and rehabilitation purposes. And so it'll be interesting to see, now that they have this infusion of additional funds, how will their expenditure of Transnet funds, how will that, you know, will that occur? Will they start to fall behind? Or, you know, I don't know.
The statement was made in the meeting with him yesterday, and I question the validity of it. It said that the mayor's staff quoted their budget for pothole repair was $1.5 million a year. That boggled my mind. It couldn't be right.
Seems low.
Well, just on this sort of use it or lose it concept, I mean, what you say makes perfect sense. The real question, I guess, is the extent to which that's just like a toss-off explanation that is used to explain why the money's not getting spent. But if there were some concept over use it or lose it, other than with, you know, a vote of the board to permit exceptions, there would be a little bit more onus on an entity to demonstrate that the reason that they haven't used it is in fact because, not just because, oh, if I say this, they'll give me a pass, right? So, I don't know, it just, you know, I'm sure you've all sat through plenty of these meetings where we kind of talk about this same thing, you know, over and over. So, I don't know, maybe I just want to throw out there people should take note, perhaps, as part of the review process as they're thinking about what are the ways that we could perhaps tweak some of the requirements in the ordinance to, you know, think a little bit more about whether there's any validity to this notion that, you know, it's just sort of too easy to not spend money when the public is kind of outraged that money needs to get spent and things need to get completed.
I have one other question that relates to this, going back to the 70-30 split and then this definition about pothole repair versus overlayment. When our auditors go out there and ascertain compliance with the 70-30, are they just doing accountant's work and looking at numbers, or are they looking in the files and get to the nature of the projects and passing judgment that, yes, that was a congestion relief as distinct from maintenance? Do they go to that next step and have the wherewithal to do that?
Yeah, one of the procedures is that they have to review 25%, at a minimum of 25% of the expenditures. They pull the documents, and they do look. They do look. And every so often I receive questions like, is this a valid use? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. You know, and it's, they review the RTIP as well to ensure that the projects, the way that they're spending them and applying them are in accordance with the RTIP, that 70-30 split. Yeah. And I have one more item related to this here. On the indirect cost allocation plan proposed guidelines. Bring that up. So at your July 27 or July meeting, 2017 meeting, you reviewed and proposed guidelines for an indirect cost allocation plan, and then we went ahead and we provided that to the member agencies. We received comments back from the county, City of San Diego, and City of La Mesa, and you know, they do have some valid concerns regarding how the proposed guidelines, as they're written, would affect their use of Transnet. And so we are, in order for us to adequately review this and work with the jurisdictions, we are asking that we be given through the rest of the fiscal year to work on this issue, and maybe possibly with the compliance audit subcommittee. So we have a body to discuss this with, other than just the ITAC as a whole.
So practically speaking, that would be that the entirety of fiscal 18 would be a let's figure it out, and that anything adopted would be for purposes of fiscal 19.
20. It would be, right, yeah, we would have to skip a year, right, yes.
I can't imagine any problem with giving them more time. I mean,
And part of it is to give us more time to sort through it and see.
Give you more time.
Yeah.
To try to get a consensus that makes sense. We can wait for our chairman to return it. Good heavens, we've been in this predicament for how many years so far?
Yeah, we've been working towards kind of this, right. And we don't want to rush into something that would potentially not work. And it's not that we're just gonna, you know, hand everybody what they think we should do. We want to have the right plan to bring forward.
Will you bring it up to us again by the end of the year?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
And so you're also asking, would it be for us to vote to empower the compliance subcommittee to?
This is an
information. Yeah, it just kind of,
would just be an additional task for the subcommittee, I think, within their purview.
Okay.
Dustin, I think we sort of agreed, they want until the end of the year to bring us any recommendations on the indirect allocation, the indirect cost to be charged. There's some differences of opinion amongst the member agencies. They'd like to work it out, and rather than answering the issue immediately, they want to continue working through the end of the year on it. And I don't think any of us have any objections to that.
It's a very complex issue.
It is.
Have all sorts of groups in place. I thought we talked about the fact that they have to have an audited indirect cost system in place.
It wasn't necessarily that it had to be audited. We were saying that it had to have a certain review level.
There was a federal, I thought there was a federal guideline.
Yes, there was some standard for such.
Right.
My original concern was whether cash-strapped municipalities were just offloading a lot of the regular costs into the funds. And it sounds to me like there are some minimum procedures to preclude that from happening.
Right. Absolutely, right. Yeah.
So it's not a voting item,
No.
it's just
No.
Okay.
It's reporting to us. Veronica?
Yes, I have a question for the committee to clarify more. There was a really healthy discussion on the funds that have not been requested, going back to attachment 2, and disbursements for the local agencies. I just want to clarify what you're recommending versus actions you're requiring us to take. So there was an idea about publishing a report showing, for example, the San Diego 33 million that's there, or talking to media, and also even talking to the board about looking at requirements. So are these all just discussion and recommendations? And
I think at this point they're discussion.
I want to know if there's any follow-up.
That's the vice chair's arm waving. Nothing more.
Dick was wondering if you have Andrew's phone number.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Lisa. So moving on, the next meeting is scheduled for November 8th at 9:30. Anybody let me know if they have a conflict or will be unable to attend.
The city of San Diego will be visiting us that day.
Yeah.
Their annual meeting.
I'm sorry, did you say
Exciting.
9:30?
November 8th at 9:30. For that, I move, anybody, I was just doing adjourning?
Nope, no objection.
All those in favor? All right. Thank you.
We should commend